All right, so welcome everyone, and I'm excited to introduce Don Arnosti, who is an environmental. Now he's an environmental consultant, but has done um, over 30 years working in advocacy and also in many multiple positions with many nonprofits across the state. And he's going to talk about the role of regulatory agencies in protecting our environment and how recent examples indicate a lack of accountability and what we might do about it to restore public trust and protect the environment. So I'm going to let you take it away, Don. And also, if you have questions during the presentation, you can put them in the chat and we can ask them later, or we can address them during the conversation if it's a short question. So take it away, Don, and yeah, looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to share my screen now so we can get into the, so you can all see my face here, and that will be the last time for a while. It's good to see all of you. I know some of you, and it's great to be speaking to the League of Women Voters. This way from start. There we go. Okay. So the title of my talk is Regulatory Accountability, as Sam indicated, and I'm going to go digging back a little bit into our nation's history and basically my goal, and what I think our national goal should be is to do what Abraham Lincoln called out in his Gettysburg Address. He was feeling that the Civil War was a battle for accountability, government accountability, and to keep a government of, by, and for the people, so it shall not perish from the earth. Those are some of the words from his Gettysburg Address, and I think that was a very good call out of at least what we aspire to be here in the United States. Sam mentioned, here's a bit of my background. Many of you know this. He mentioned that I forgot some of it. I had 35 years to work in a number of places, but it gives you an idea. I have pretty broad experience here in Minnesota working in conservation with a variety of groups. My focus of the talk will be examples having to do with environmental agencies and environmental issues. Those of you who are active in other aspects of government, social, health, those sorts of things, you may feel an echo in terms of the circumstances and the examples that I give. You may find, oh, I'm seeing that also in my interactions. I believe that this is it is not simply a condition of environmental agencies or our government having to do with the environment. It's broader than that. But my experience and my discussion will focus on the environment because that's where my knowledge lies. So going back to the beginning, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. We the people implies who's in charge and who should be benefiting, right? This quote on the left there was a woman who questioned Benjamin Franklin when he was exiting the Constitutional Convention, which was chaired by George Washington. Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy? I guess there was a lot of debate going on in terms of the form of government. And the famous quote is, a republic if you can keep it. And what my thesis is it's slipping from our grasp. And this is not the first time in our history that that's the case. It's almost like pendulum swinging. But at the point, what I'm going to be laying out is, I believe we are straying from we the people. And we'll dig into this a little bit more. It was recognized that the Constitution was imperfect. That was recognized at the time. In fact, there were 2 states that refused to endorse the Constitution and join the Union until what we now call the Bill of Rights were passed. So the Bill of Rights followed 2 years on the Constitution. People were already working to perfect our Union at that point. I want to just lay out a little bit. You sometimes hear democracy, our democracy or our republic, and to the republic for which it stands, in the Pledge of Allegiance. So what is the difference here? And this was something that was very closely debated when you go back and read, which I did some reading in preparation for this talk. There were a lot of debates about the form of government and how purely democratic should we be. And basically what the founders set up for us was a republic that is representative democracy, where the people control who's elected, at least in some form or another. In those days, the Senate was appointed, but it was appointed by elected officials, for example. But they also did something really somewhat unique, setting up separate but equal branches of government to distribute power and control each other. And they were very upfront about they were constructing government in this way to safeguard the rights of the minority from a pure democracy, where a pure democracy majority rules, that's it. 49% gets crushed, or 5%, as the case may be. The minority could be all kinds of people that may be considered a minority. So we have a finely balanced form of government that had not been recognized before, created before like this, and we need to continue to struggle to perfect it. Move on here. Okay, it's failing to advance. There we go. About the same time as this was happening, there was a new form of social interaction created, which is a public corporation. There were private companies going back many, many years, going back thousands of years, where private individuals got together and shipped goods somewhere or, did things. But a public corporation was really only emerged in the last several hundred years, and most strongly in the last 200 or 250 years. And public corporations were recognized as basically a partnership between the government, which was of, by, and for the people, hopefully, and representing the public good, that often was short of capital because there were not very solid ways to raise funds then. They mostly got funds from duties at ports, for example, and various other taxes on liquor or things of that nature. It was irregular and not a robust flow of money to the government. So to accomplish public goods, primarily things like building roads, building canals, or this is a map of railroads, that developed, and everybody are quite familiar with the fact that our government granted vast amounts of land in return for the public good of creating a railroad. But more importantly than that, in some ways, is the definition of a public corporation. And public corporations receive two massive benefits, which they still experience. They are conferred, in essence, personhood under the laws of the nation, and perpetual personhood, because they, of course, are virtual items. They don't die. And in my view, we don't have the death penalty for them, because there are some corporations that I believe should have their charter extinguished, but we don't do that. And there's also limited liability for the shareholders. So the corporation, like if they act in a malfeasant manner, the corporation pays the fine, not the individual shareholders. Now, in return for the public purpose, these goods were granted to corporations. However, in the last 50 or 60 years, Milton Friedman was very prominent 50 years ago in terms of advancing the thesis that the public good, the social responsibility of business, is to increase or maximize its profits. And that's where it begins and ends. And indeed, many public charters for public corporations these days are the public purpose line is filled out saying any legal purpose. In other words, they don't say, I'm here to open a grocery store. I'm here to, sell goods cheaply online. I'm here to do this. I'm here to do, they no longer justify themselves. And generally speaking, the courts have gone along with this, and our society, the majority of people have been born since this point of view has been uh, put forward, and many people no longer expect any public purpose or any public good to come from a business. The underlying laws are still there, but they're not fundamentally enforced. And honestly, I think that's part of the problem. I'm just raising, this history so we understand where things came from, but that changed. Another key part of our society is public good that is accomplished by charitable organizations. I have traveled to about 50 countries in the world. I've lived in about a half a dozen of them, and nowhere else have I found anything like the robust NGO community that we have here. Europe has some of it. A few other countries have some of it, but nobody is as bountifully provided by publicly chartered, public interest, non-governmental organizations. In most countries, there certainly is public charity or private charity conducted on behalf of a public good. It's almost always coming through religious organizations. We are benefited, in my view, by having groups like the League of Women Voters and many others that I placed on the screen there to supplement what government is able to do and what, frankly, public corporations are failing to do these days. Let me see it. Okay, there we go. About the same time that Milton Friedman was declaring that it's sufficient public purpose for a publicly chartered corporation to make the maximum amount of money, we the people were getting a little upset with some of the byproducts of kind of unfettered pursuit of private interest. We were getting fed up with pollution. And the dead bird on the right is representing Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, and her seminal books actually in the 50s and 60s. She was writing for about 20 years, Silent Spring being the most famous one in, I believe it was 1963. The list of laws and agencies there at the federal level at the top there and at the state level at the bottom, that all happened between like the later 1960s and about 1980. So a burst of 12 to 15 years, we had amazing seminal acts being passed by our nation's Congress on a bipartisan basis. And here in Minnesota, we created anybody, if you don't understand MPCA, for example, the Pollution Control Agency, EPA, very, very seminal acts. This picture, by the way, is one of multiple times when the Cuyahoga River in downtown Cleveland burst into flames because there were flammable pollution that was floating down the river. This was one of the attention-grabbing times when it was quite large flames, when you see the river flaming. And that was something that I recall as a teenager being something that, was spread on the news and was very attention-grabbing. It's like, oh my God, pollution's gotten so bad that we have flaming rivers. So we had these kind of two directions going at once. And in the late 60s and 70s, it was felt if we passed these laws, if we establish some new agencies whose responsibility is to implement these laws, we should be able to deal with these issues. That was the solution du jour. And for a time, government seemed to be the solution. People supported government. The Superfund tax, for instance, was passed in 1980. It lasted for 15 years until it was not renewed by a Congress in a different era. And of course, that was taking care of, call it orphaned pollution from previous spills and previous industries. We, believe it or not, before the passage of the Clean Water Act, we're talking 50 years ago roughly, most communities did not have what we would consider any effective wastewater treatment. So there was billions of gallons of raw sewage that was being dumped into rivers nationwide. Small communities, big communities. The Mississippi River below St. Paul was biologically dead for 10 or 15 miles as a result of the poorly treated waste that was being dumped into the river around Pig's Eye. Federal government came forward with 90 cents on the dollar to build water treatment plants, tens of thousands of them across the nation. Huge steps forward. The bald eagle, of course, was brought back from the brink of extinction and is now very common, certainly here in Minnesota. There was a lot of talk of logging, clear cutting, old growth forests. We passed a lot of laws and regulations, and the Forest Service is no longer at least explicitly targeting old growth to harvest. And of course, air pollution is much better in many ways, certainly the visible pollutants. So we made some progress and things happened. However, about 45 years ago, excuse me, I got a frog in my throat. Government was, elections changed, slogans changed, and government is the problem became the watchword. And we've really lived for the last 40, 45 years in an environment where that is a predominant perspective, rather than government being a solution, passing laws, creating agencies, supporting them, funding wastewater treatment plants. There's been a philosophy, the government is the problem. And I asked somewhat rhetorically, when is the last time you've heard an elected official referred to as a public servant? That used to be the term for public officials. And indeed, in the early years of Minnesota, it was almost like whoever drew the short straw had to go to the legislature for a 2-year stint to represent the community. It was very much viewed as a sacrifice, public servant, and other farmers would cover your farm while you were in St. Paul doing the people's business. We've often lost that, and many, many people are running for elected office, and you kind of wonder what is their purpose here? What are they doing? Are they advancing themselves, or are they advancing their honest, sincere interpretation of what they think the public good is? Excuse me. Chuck Williams, MPCA commissioner under Arnie Carlson in the early 90s, was kind of famous, and it was shocking at the time. He made a big point of saying the actual customers of the MPCA are the regulated businesses. And he sort of wanted to change the culture of the workers at the MPCA to serve the interests of the people who are applying for permits. Now, there's obviously a tension there between being an efficient and effective government, and which I think we can all agree we all want, and sort of understanding maybe the customer is always right, and it's your job to think of the people asking for permission from the public to pollute as the customers. So it was a kind of a slippery slope. I brought up there the 5-4 Citizens United decision, 5-4, basically a 1-vote margin in the Supreme Court has had inordinate influence on our society. And I think the League of Women Voters is well aware of this. I think this is something you pay a lot of attention to. But in essence, that decision that was probably 15 years old now equated dollars to speech and threw out a lot of limitations on political contributions, and it sort of underscored that corporations have the rights of people, including the right to free speech. These are all just kind of markers along the path as we took this swing from we the people to maybe a different perspective. It's a very slippery slope. And what I'm about to get into now are specific instances where I think Minnesota state agencies, began to slide down this slope of looking away from issues under their jurisdiction, inconvenient. We don't have enough resources to pursue every case. So maybe the most politically connected or most powerful are the ones that we don't have the resources to pursue, failing to enforce the law evenly or at all, or acting in a manner that's directly contrary to law, which is really a very striking circumstance. I'm going to give examples of all of these things right here in Minnesota. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is a young agency. It was formed in the late 1960s, so 55 years or so ago, or 57, I guess. It was established with a citizen governing board. Appointed citizens actually had the power to run the agency through a commissioner that they could hire and fire and the staff. About 26 years later, Chuck Williams, who I quoted before, he made a shift where he referred to the regulated parties as customers, but he was also made the chair of the board. So rather than being subservient to the board in terms of hired and fired by the board, he actually, again, these were changes in law, but it happened during this time. He became the first commissioner chair of the board, which is a definite shift in power, right? From a citizen-led agency to a political appointee. I just note that 2001 made a lot of changes in our country, and I'm talking about September 11th and the shock that was to our country. But prior to that, government agencies were pretty much open door. And I had a substantial part of my professional career during that time. And it was very easy to walk into any government agency as a citizen, inquire for a person, a staffer that you wanted to speak with, and to be able to sit down with them or walk through the agency and talk to different people. And I used to drop in on the DNR and the MPCA all the time and just maybe have an appointment with one person, but go drop in on several other people. Government was more open in the era when we were less concerned about security. So I just note that. In 2015, the legislature eliminated the MPCA board, and I would say with the acquiescence of the MPCA commissioner at the time. And that was over political retribution because the board had dared to overrule the staff and require a 9,000 cow dairy to perform an environmental impact statement about their potential impacts. I would bring forward that the petition requesting the EIS was actually led by farmer neighbors of the proposed facility. This was not an urban-rural kind of divide or a left-right kind of thing. This was neighbors of the surrounding community that were very concerned about the odors, the water pollution, the water use, the manure, etc. The board heard that as a citizen-led board, and they overruled the staff and the commissioner, and in return, the legislature got rid of all vestiges of citizen transparency and citizen control of the board, and the commissioner was okay with that. 2020, I just mentioned another step in this slippery slope of less transparent government. The MPCA, and not the MPCA alone, DNR and other state agencies implemented a routine destruction of interagency communications after only 24 hours. They also do this, for instance, staff emails are only kept for 6 months. So if you think about this, and this is across government, this has just happened in the last 4 years or so, it's facilitated by technology, right? If in the decades ago, if you had told every employee that they had to shred every note and memo that they received over the last 6 months, that probably wouldn't have happened. People just wouldn't follow through. But right now, there's a central technological guru that just pushes a button and all the files are deleted. This is something that I and others have been raising as a real problem in terms of transparency of government. If there is no record of how government decisions are made, 6 months is the longest documents are being kept. There are notes and other draft documents that are being destroyed in anywhere from 1 day to 1 week. So you can meet with a government official and say, how did you ever arrive at this decision? And there's no record. Here's the final decision. It's a real erosion of transparent government. I need to move on. The legislature is part of the problem here, as I've mentioned. They have created conflicts of interest in our agencies. This slide points out a number of them. Department of Ag promotes agriculture and regulates fertilizers and pesticides, even in cities. And of course, we know that fertilizers and pesticides are the primary pollutants that are of concern in agriculture. The Department of Natural Resources promotes and regulates mining and forestry. And again, the question is, what kind of balance are you getting there in terms of promoting the industry, which arguably has public benefits in terms of jobs and products that they produce, but also produces impacts to public resources, and how much are they protecting those resources? So the fact that some of our regulatory agencies are burdened with a dual mission, in my view, is part of the problem. And that could be straightened out.
I'm done just mentioning it's 10 o'clock.
Yep, thank you. Through agency leadership, through multiple administrations of all political parties, and by all I'm including Jesse Ventura's third party, these issues have arisen. Here's some of the issues that we've mentioned. Some of them I don't have time to go into all of them. You can ask questions about them later. One thing that really burns me is towards the bottom there, we've paid $13.5 million to private law firms instead of funneling the cash to the Attorney General's office, where the staff is explicitly sworn to act in the public interest. The MPCA and the DNR went to the industry and hired industry-aligned lawyers to advise them on how to write and produce the permits for Polymet. Now, many of us know how that's turned out. They've produced illegal permits. And when I say illegal, that's been validated by court lawsuits and the Supreme Court. This was just a complete disaster. And the fact, as this was occurring, I was objecting in the legislature and directly to the agency and appealing to attorney generals, et cetera. But this was a step that the state took. Instead of funneling money to our public interest attorneys that would advise how to grant the permits and follow the law, we took attorneys with conflicts of interest and paid for them. I'm going to flip through some other examples here. Fish kills are a common occurrence in farm country. People may not know it. The larger ones are the ones that kind of hit the news. There was a big one in the Whitewater River in 2016. 3 different agencies pursued an investigation for a year. Notably, they waited 24 to 48 hours to show up. And if you know how streams work, by the time they're taking samples, presumably the flush of pollutants that caused the fish kill are somewhere downstream. And guess what? They did this investigation and they couldn't find a cause. And that's because, if you drag your feet, the evidence is probably down in the Mississippi River by the time you get there to sample it. So farming practices can lead to these things, and we kind of have studiously avoiding the issue. This has been an issue that's been in the news quite a bit. DNR recent management of wildlife management areas with a focus on timber harvest. Many employees have been very upfront about their concern about this publicly, even at the risk of their career. The Fish and Wildlife Service has suspended, which is an oversight agency for some of the federal dollars that are funneled through the DNR for wildlife management. They've suspended $28 million from the state of Minnesota until they took steps to validate their management as wildlife directed and not timber directed. And last year, internal survey of DNR employees found that 90% of those answering the survey did not support the timber management occurring. This is DNR's own field level employees who are saying we're doing the wrong thing. And I want to take the opportunity to point out that many of the agency staffers, the line staffers, they're completely congruent with trying to do the public good and follow the law and implement things. And indeed, as an environmentalist, many of the times when I looked most smart and most knowledgeable, it was because there was somebody in an agency who was feeding me the real information. The problem really lies usually in the commissioner's office, the level at which political pressure comes to bear on our agencies. The question of whether it's going to continue to follow the law and do the public interest, or if it's going to be pushed in a different direction. This was some private some private sampling that the Isaac Walton League did in the Austin area over 2 summers, over 500 samples of water quality, particularly looking for E. coli, which comes from human or animal waste and is hazardous if you're swimming in this river. This river is promoted by DNR as a recreational river, yet over 70% of the time that they took samples during the course of these 2 summers, the samples exceeded health limits. It would be unhealthy to swim in the river, even as it's being promoted as a recreational canoeing and swimming river. And we found the sources using DNA sampling methods were both livestock and human. There was a lot of pressure put on the county, and they said, we'll get a 10-year plan to address the human. And the livestock sources were just doing more of the same, which is educating farmers. And I don't think it's a lack of education that's the issue. We've had decades of education. It's there's no consequences for, doing things the wrong way. In an irony, the safest place routinely to swim in the river was just below the Austin city sewage outflow. And this was proven by our samples. And the reason is that the water treatment plant at the city of Austin was functioning well, and they were putting safe water into the stream and diluting the ambient pollution down below the limits, so that in an irony, if I were the parent of a small child in Austin, I'd say, whatever you do, make sure you're swimming in the river right below the sewage outfall. That would actually, from a scientific perspective, be the safest place to swim. Park Rapids municipal water was polluted by nitrates. This came from potato agriculture nearby. I believe it was $14 million was paid in public dollars to drill a deeper public water system. Again, these are kind of private pollution that has not been adequately addressed, and it results in human health impacts and a designated trout stream nearby being polluted. Water gremlin is something that hit the news about 5 years ago, but for many years, through 17 years, they were releasing trichloroethylene and lead through air emissions into the surrounding community. On one side, the MPCA only had 9 inspectors for 3,500 dischargers. That's just completely inadequate to do any kind of a follow-up. And it was local residents who had to sue the agency to get the data to kind of expose what they were feeling and knowing. Today, more recently, There's been a Smith Foundry in the East Phillips neighborhood that is kind of the same situation hitting the news. And this came about because of oversight by the EPA, the federal EPA, that did a surprise inspection of the foundry and found a lot of the same types of problems, lead and other contaminants being released into areas of habitation. Recently, the MPCA downgraded their so-called class 3 and 4 standards, limiting pollution from mining and other polluters. This was put into place. The quotes on the right there are the MPCA in their statement of need and reasonableness justifying the changes. They're basically trying to reduce the workload down to the amount of staff they have rather than appeal for more staff. And basically, these, again, quotes from the MPCA, the changes will result in fewer and less restrictive limits and permits, in other words, more pollution, and thereby decrease the cost of complying to the polluter compared to the current rules. And that's what was achieved. The comments, and there were about 500 comments, the public was overwhelmingly opposed, but the mining industry weighed in a number of small cities that were concerned about the cost of complying with these standards because the federal government is no longer offering 90% cost match for wastewater treatment plants. I mentioned back in the 70s, the original deal was 90%. And it made it possible for small communities to have very effective and modern wastewater treatment plants. We're not making those kind of investments anymore. This is, oops, sorry. This is a summary of, let's say, following private corporate interest versus the public interest. Some of these you've seen before. I don't think we have time to dig into all of these, so I'm going to move on. Going to just briefly mention something that's been very much in the news, which is groundwater contamination in southeastern Minnesota. This has been a decades-long problem. The predominant sources have been quantified in dozens of studies to be manure spreading from confined animal feeding operations, CAFOs, and agricultural fertilizer. The result is nitrate pollution, which is harmful to humans, harmful to other mammals, livestock, and harmful to wildlife as well. This has been known about for years, I mean, decades, particularly in southeastern Minnesota, which is karst region, porous sandstone, where the connection between the surface and the groundwater is practically instantaneous in many places where there's sinkholes and other direct channels. We have multiple agency failures here: Department of Health, Pollution Control Agency, DNR, and Department of Agriculture. The petition was to the EPA to step in and do their oversight and say this is an emergency. There's approximately 9,000 people who are on proven contaminated water that is unhealthy for them, and something needs to be done about it under the Safe Drinking Water Act. The EPA validated this and came back with specific orders for the state to be responsive and provide those people with clean water and to improve their long-term plans to reduce this pollution. The clean water is being provided for the people, but the state of Minnesota is dragging its feet about doing anything more than continuing to educate farmers about following best practices. We've been doing that for decades, and we have increasing contamination, again, as proven by scientific studies. If we want things to change, we need to do things differently. So this is the wrap here. We need to restore regulatory accountability. And I think the things that you and the League of Women Voters can do, you individually and you collectively, is to learn about regulatory failures, educate your friends and neighbors about the importance of protecting water, health, and future, advocate for oversight, whether it's effective legislative oversight, whether it's effective The federal EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service, where I mentioned they stepped in at the request of Minnesota citizens who were saying, and I was part of the Fish and Wildlife Service stepping in on the timber harvest abuses by the state of Minnesota, appealed to the people who have authority over our state agencies to push back against the pressure that the agencies are feeling to do things not in the public interest. Demand an elimination of conflict of interest in our agencies. That will take changes in law. But to point that out and say, you're not making it easier for these agencies to do their job if they're supposed to work both sides of the equation. When we have the Pollution Control Agency, we have other agencies, they should be there to look out for the public interest. Of course, be in contact with elected officials and express your values to them. Vote for and support the candidates that say, I want to restore the public in our public agencies, that the customer is the public, not the regulated party that's asking for permission to pollute the public resource. And of course, stay involved in groups like the League of Women Voters that works hard to bring the public interest forward in our electoral system. A couple last notes I want to have before we stop for questions. I just want to put the text of the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act, one of those seminal laws passed 50 years ago. This is law in Minnesota. And I think this is something that people should bring back and put in front of decision makers and lawmakers and say, the law is that the legislature finds and declares that each person is entitled by right to the protection, preservation, and enhancement of air, water, land, and other natural resources located within the state, and that each person has the responsibility to contribute to the protection, preservation, and enhancement thereof. It is just really strongly trying to put that public purpose and public interest in front of people. This law does form the basis of numerous environmental lawsuits, but it is something that doesn't just have to be part of a lawsuit. It should be part of just everyday decision making. And finally, a note about youth. Youth are very concerned about their environmental future, especially the effects of global warming. And I think that members of this committee know that. That is an overarching and overriding issue that people are very concerned about. The youth in particular has been saturated in negative information about this. Many of them are discouraged, but many of them are also ready to stand up and demand action like Greta Thunberg pictured here. The question is, are we going to let them lead? In many instances, the youth are ahead of those of us of older generations, particularly on an issue like global warming. And they learn and act differently. They learn online and via influencers, young spokespeople like Greta Thunberg. And I think it would behoove the League of Women Voters to think in turn, listen to the young voices you have and let them shape the manner in which you function and act, to allow them to grow into their leadership and hopefully address some of the issues that we older generations have not adequately dealt with. This is like a personal commitment I make, and I think it leads to sanity, where you feel like you can't be responsible for everything, but you can do something good every day for the environment. And that's where I'll leave it, and then we can have questions.
Thank you so much, John. The Climate Change Task Force is excited that you brought this engaging and important discussion forward, and we're going to now stop the recording and have and decide and think about any questions you have for Don, and also what, if any, actions we'll take going forward.